Welcome to Specialization of Consciousness, Chapter 9 of Economics, Time, Mind, and Spirit. If you can imagine anything, can you imagine not imagining anything? Our first approach to understanding consciousness will be to consider a series of relationships between awareness and consciousness. Given the language we've been developing in this course, awareness would be the impressions on one's body and mind. Consciousness would be awareness of being aware. Self-consciousness as awareness of being conscious. And transcendence as awareness of being self-conscious. So if there is a finite capacity for awareness, and we build off the model of economics of mind, what we can imagine is the energy, the psychological energy that is available for all these different states of consciousness, awareness, consciousness, self-consciousness, transcendence, and that our overall sense of well-being is a function of how much we are in these different states, but it's subject to the amount of energy required to be in these various states or mix of states. As we move from being conscious to self-conscious to transcendence, there's an increasing need for energy. So there's an increasing amount of energy associated with this. What we experience is based on how we focus our consciousness. And how we focus our consciousness is influenced by both our external environment, right, the material and social world we're in, and our internal environment, feelings, beliefs, and reasons. So if there are loud noises or bright flashes, they tend to capture our attention. So there's a redistribution of attention which affects what we are conscious of, while our subconscious may change how we are conscious of it. Sometimes we consciously choose to avoid being distracted. So this requires a disciplined mind and practice. So those that maybe work on mindfulness or various exercises to not get distracted. And this leads us to a perspective of consciousness being on a spectrum. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, Ken Wilber wrote that awareness of the world exists on a spectrum from the subatomic to the galactic, so based on size, and from shadow to enlightenment, so brightness. And that our personal experience is a particular perspective of a universal whole consciousness. So this is an extension of many traditions, especially Eastern philosophies, going back thousands of years. Now, this is a graph from Ken Wilber's book, The Spectrum of Consciousness, and he proposes 4 quadrants. One quadrant is the I, so the self in consciousness. Then there's the it, so that's brain and organism, so a similar distinction between mind and brain. There's we, that's culture and worldview, and then its, social system and environment. So along the first quadrant with self and consciousness, we start off with an instinctual self and then develop into a magical self, warrior self, mythic self, achiever self, a sensitive self, a holistic self, and an integral self. In the it quadrant, we start off from organic states, certain organic molecules, basic life forms, development of smaller living organisms, organs, then larger organisms, and so forth. In culture and worldview, we start off with what we call the archaic, and then it develops through the animistic or magical, then the existence of power gods, mythic orders, into the realm of scientific and rationality, into a pluralistic worldview, into holistic, and then again, integral. And he sees this as going from the pre-modern world and culture to the modern world, which is the scientific rational, to postmodern. And then with respect to social systems and environments, the smallest scale would be survival clans, so small numbers of people foraging just to survive, expanding into ethnic tribes, feudal empires, early nations, corporate states, what he calls value communities, then holistic commons, and integral meshworks. So we can get another image of this by overlaying the expanding spheres. And we do this with a little series of colored expanding circles just to reinforce the notion of what's going on in terms of scale. Now, in terms of brightness, the persona level, that's persona and shadow, is the distinctions Wilber works with. And then moving up, there's ego in contrast to body. There's the organism as a whole in contrast to their environment. He suggests as this continues to develop, eventually you get to a universal level and what he refers to as unity consciousness. If we're using scale as a form of understanding consciousness, then we can understand a relationship between wavelength and perception. So perception is relative to the focus of consciousness. Long wavelengths will appear constant or as slow-moving change, right? As if it is moving us. Mid-wavelengths will appear as awareness of change, yet a unique moment. Short wavelengths will appear as repeated events, which can be statistically analyzed as physical events. Let's take a look at this visually. So if you have a very, very narrow focus of a waveform, right, so sound, it may look like it's just a constant line, right, because it's not changing much at all. So the immediate run, right, from when we were talking about the economic run. So the immediate run is where one cannot change things, right? What's there is there. If you have a little less narrow focus, now what you can see is that while there is some change occurring, but you may not be aware of the cycles going on. You might be left with the impression, oh, something's increasing. When we get into medium focus, the realm where we start seeing that there is a waveform, right? In other words, there is a cycling of up and down and returning to an origin. So if you have a medium focus, you're aware of a particular cycle, so it's as if it's a particular event. And so this is reminiscent of the short run, where some things are variable and some things are not. If we go into a wider focus, we still see the cycles, but now we see multiple cycles. And in this case, this is opening up a long run perspective. It's not just about getting through an experience, it's a recognition that you're going to have this experience repeatedly, but there's a certain consistency within what these cycles look like. But if you get into a very wide focus, you can be aware that there are these cycles, but on top of that, there can be cycles about how things cycle. And this is reminiscent of the very long run where even technology and preferences are variable, because it's no longer to optimize my decisions because I'm going to have to do this repeatedly. But if even what you're doing is changing, then the types of decisions you have to make need to take into account that what you'll be doing in the future is not necessarily what you're going to be doing now. What would be optimal for a repeated set of choices right now is not necessarily what's optimal as what is feasible and acceptable might change. or what your preferences might change. Again, going back to the psychological energy constraint, instead of looking at it as awareness, consciousness, self-consciousness, and transcendence, we can talk about the physical, emotional, rational, and transcendent or spiritual. Right? So the immediate short run, the energy available for reason, in other words, reflective thought, decreases as more energy is used to process physically and emotionally. That's one of the challenges then that we face with economics of mind. If we're going to specialize in a particular type of consciousness, let's say physical consciousness, it will tend to be, in the short run, at the cost of being able to process things rationally. So given these finite resources to distribute over the spectrum of consciousness, individuals in society would tend to specialize in how to experience the world. So this leads people to specialize in different realms of consciousness. What would be an example of that? Well, let's consider the contrast of caregivers and economists. Caretakers of infants focus more on the physical and emotional realms, since this is how infants express themselves, right? So if you're going to take care of infants, what you're going to be aware of are how infants can communicate. And that typically is not at the rational level. On the other hand, if you're an economist, you focus more on the rational realm, where data and mathematical models are the dominant modes of expression. So if you continue to be a caregiver over a long period of time, that specialization shows up at being able to be better, more efficient with caretaking of infants, but probably less capable of doing advanced modeling. Whereas if you're more from a statistical, economic, scientific perspective, and that's what you're specializing in, might be wonderfully efficient dealing with data and creating mathematical models, but maybe not as good at taking care of infants. So through experience and education, each of us specializes in how we are conscious of the world we live in. In economics, specialization is understood as being very important, but specialization by itself is not very useful. It's only if there's specialization and trade. In the realm of consciousness, the extent that we can benefit from specialization of consciousness depends on our ability to trade information, insights, warnings with each other. Imagine a circular castle with a lookout in each direction. Each person is specializing in consciousness of a particular direction. But it's only beneficial if they can share critical events with the others. In other words, if you were the only lookout at the top of the castle, you wouldn't just stand in one position looking out at the horizon and never walking around to see what else is going on. You would have to go around. And so maybe you lose some of the advantage of staying focused on one particular direction so that you can see all the things that are going on, right? So if you're by yourself, you give up occasionally looking in one direction to see the other direction, so you do have these blind spots. It's only if you have other people then that can be focused on those areas that you're not looking at that you can be confident that your specialization is beneficial in the long run, but only if you can all share the information. Right? So this also occurs when people specialize in how they look at the world and world events. Now consider specialization with respect to varying width of a moment, as we were starting to before. So if well-being is based on a diversification of realms of consciousness, then it can be beneficial to have different focus around the moment. So what does this mean? This can be understood as differing discount rates looking into the future or back into the past. Thus, some people would focus on physical events, so that would be a very steep discount rate, others on emotional events, and yet others going off into the realm of the rational or the spiritual and transcendent. And again, exchanging information based on us diversification can allow greater well-being for all. So again, it's not just a specialization, it's specialization when other people are specializing in other aspects of how to be conscious of the world. Here's one clear example: specialization of financial focus. Is your role focused on pennies or dollars, or is it focused on millions of dollars? So we're dealing with scale of decision making. Is it revenues or costs, right? So if you're a salesperson, you're focused on revenue. That's your specialization. You're not necessarily going to be that concerned about the cost of production. On the other hand, if you're a manager or a technician and your role is not about sales, you will tend to be more focused on the costs of production. Some businesses, you have people specializing in sales and others specializing on production and the cost of production. And that specialization is useful as long as there's a communication and a decision maker that can take both sets of informations and perspectives and optimize in terms of maximizing profits, for example. Persons who do the grocery shopping become more attuned to when inexpensive items like a loaf of bread or cereal or soup are at a good price, right? Which means distinguishing at the level of cents, or at most a few dollars. If soup is normally $3.39, and now it's on sale for $2.99, that distinction of that 40 cents, you might, if you're specialized in this, have the impact of, oh, that's a very good price. On the other hand, persons that are specialized at this level of financial focus may have no idea of whether paying $1 billion for a business is a bargain, right? That's not where their expertise is at. Their expertise is in discerning price distinctions at a small scale. Likewise, an investor might have no clue when a quart of ice cream is inexpensive, but have an excellent idea of when the price is right to buy out a company. We can analogize consciousness and specialization in terms of stem cells. So stem cells are undifferentiated cells from a multicellular organism that are capable of reproducing more of the same, and from which other types of cells can be differentiated. Many of the leading edge developments in healthcare and medicine are working with stem cells in generating new body parts, either organs or skin. So they start off with these undifferentiated cells, and depending on how they grow them, they end up with cells that are differentiated and specialized for the type of organ they're going to be used for. So an early fetus will have many stem cells, of which most will eventually become specific, right? So eventually they become muscles or neurons, bones, various organs. The immediate value of a cell is increased by being differentiated or specialized, but its potential is foregone to be something different. In this specialization of these cells, there is also a specialization of consciousness at the cellular level. So this raises a question of liquidity of consciousness. In the same way that cash is a liquid asset, which has almost no productive value in itself, but has immediate exchange value, consciousness, when focused, in other words, fixed, has greater productive value, but must be made liquid in order to be exchanged or transformed. So in the same way that a gardener tills or breaks up the soil before seeding, sometimes the mind must be tilled before the seeds of new ideas or perspectives can take hold. We're dealing with this back and forth between focusing or fixing consciousness so that you can be productive in something, and then having to go through the process of making consciousness liquid so that you can change its focus. So the energy, the efforts, the resources involved with making consciousness liquid is part of the cost of transformation. Now, it'll be useful to make a distinction between perspectives and paradigms. So a perspective is relative to a location in the space of consciousness. Whatever your worldview is, a perspective is within that worldview, but can be at different locations. A paradigm is what takes information and events and transforms them in how we understand the world. So the idea being that one would exist within a paradigm or worldview before one can have a perspective. And this is a useful link to a further discussion on perspectives and paradigms, specifically paradigms. So what about choosing a paradigm? Well, example of a scientific paradigm shift from geocentric to heliocentric a few hundred years ago. So scientists eventually chose the heliocentric paradigm as it explained and predicted observations more effectively. So data that does not fit a paradigm is typically conceived of as flawed or in error. By shifting the paradigm, different perspectives become feasible and the data becomes connected with what is understood. The paradigm influences the perceived uncertainty of observations, and based on the certainty principle, the observations can be changed from ignored to heavily weighted. One of the things that happens when we have changes in paradigms, the sense of uncertainty about observations. If you have a shift, something that might have made no sense before might make clear sense now with quite a bit of certainty, which then reduces the total amount of uncertainty that an individual would be dealing with. Now observations that were originally ignored become very important data. How about an economic paradigm shift? Well, if you think of going from the classical to the neoclassical. So economists used to believe that the value of a product was determined by the amount of labor that was directly used to produce it, as well as indirectly through the capital used. Then the marginalist revolution of the late 19th century occurred, and the value of a product was understood as determined by the subjective measure of its consumer. So that's a big shift from trying to figure out, well, how much labor is going into a product, because that'll tell you what its value is going to be, to, in some sense, it doesn't make a difference how much labor goes into a product. It affects the cost, but the perception of value is based on the subjective measure of the consumer of that good. Now we can ask another question. Do paradigms have an opportunity cost? Right? Does how you look at the world have an opportunity cost? Well, one, whichever paradigm you pick, there is a risk or cost of less understanding. Right? So some things that you might have made sense before in a previous worldview may not make sense anymore. In science, they believed that there was the ether in the 18th century. Now, don't believe that anymore. So whatever descriptions of the world, explanations that occurred back then, if we were to try to read it with that, using that language, it doesn't make sense now. Another is the cost of social acceptance. So one of the issues here in terms of what paradigm with which to understand the world is what are the paradigms that other people are living their life through. So if you choose to have a very different way of looking at the world, it's going to impact how accepted you will be in society. Because if you're speaking a different language, if you're understanding the world differently, it can create more tension and friction and make it more costly to have you accepted. If you're talking about going to a new paradigm, there's the cost of transforming our minds. you don't get to have the old paradigm and the new paradigm. I mean, you may be aware that those two exist and you're contrasting, but the moment at which you're actually looking at the world and making your decisions, if you're transitioning between the two, you're going to have a transformation of mind, and that's going to have psychological and other costs. Another is pain versus doubt. In other words, in the process, are you changing constraints or are you changing preferences? So if you're changing constraints, you're more likely to run into the limits of these constraints. And this is where you get into the realm of injury and pain. Whereas if you're changing preferences, you are not necessarily running into limitations, but now in the process of changing preferences, you may have doubt about what is best, what is the optimal thing to do. Depending on what you're dealing with, whether you're changing constraints or changing preferences, will be associated with whether pain is going to be an issue in its various forms, or whether doubt is going to be the dominant issue. Another one to consider is the distinction between free will or determinism or bounded choice. If you have a view of the world that you have free will, that has different implications in terms of the meaning of your behavior, whether you can change your behavior. If you have a deterministic viewpoint, you're likely to believe that people don't change their behavior. It's already determined. And there certainly has been research in the realm of psychology which seems to suggest that individuals that believe they have free will tend to be more morally and ethically constrained than those that believe that the world is deterministic, that their behavior is already predetermined. They tend to not behave as ethically. So that's a very interesting distinction there. And then if you're dealing with bounded choice, right, you're trying to imagine a world where there is some free will and some determinism. Well, if there can be choice about paradigm, we're certainly talking about choosing what to believe. Since paradigms are closely related to belief system, we can also discuss what and how we choose to believe. This depends on the information and experiences we've been exposed to, how our beliefs affect our relationships and our ability to succeed in life, as well as how comfortable, challenging, and enjoyable it is, among many other factors. So are we constantly choosing what to believe, or do we choose only on rare occasions when we are forced to? There is reason to believe that we are not constantly updating our most fundamental beliefs. There is a lot of cost internally, and since changing beliefs also tends to lead to changing behavior, there can be a lot of disruption in life. So based on the resources available, it would be optimal to only rarely update beliefs, certainly major beliefs. So the benefits and costs of exploring a new belief system depends on the commitments and the ability to adapt successfully. And this is one of the ways we end up with intellectual ghettos. Certainly we see this on the internet quite a bit. So the idea of an intellectual ghetto is however you view the world, understand it, categories that you use, we will tend to gather and communicate only with those that have similar belief systems, because at least there is a sense of communication. It's not as challenging. It's not as threatening. And that means we're shutting out listening to not only different perspectives, but different worldviews. And we end up with kind of closed ecosystems, sometimes referred to. But the term intellectual ghetto, that's used to describe this situation. Okay, what about age and specialization? Well, individuals, like countries, specialize based on resources available, and resources change with age and experience. So the capacity to adapt limits how much and how quickly our consciousness adapts. So when we're young, we tend to have a greater capacity to adapt. As we get older and we have more commitments, and in order to make life work and make our long-term plans work, we deal with exigencies by trying to get back to the plan, as compared to kind of going off and exploring, completely new worlds or new ways of looking at things. Age and specialization. Now, this is going to come back when we're talking about the life cycle of belief, because based on the particular specialization of consciousness in the different ages and developments in our lives, different belief and belief systems are going to be one either more appealing or more useful at that time. Okay, so that completes this discussion on the specialization of consciousness. In the next chapter, since we're talking about self and mind, we're going to introduce economics when we're managing who we are as a person and decision maker.